The vast majority of government employees are hardworking public servants who deserve our appreciation and respect. But what about the bad apples who spoil the reputation of public service? The California Whistleblower Protection Act empowers the California State Auditor to investigate and report on improper governmental activities. What are their most recent findings? We'll ask our guest, Elaine Howle, the California State Auditor. Bad apples, blowing the whistle on improper government activities.
Additional funding for the Maddy report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world, and by Kaiser Permanente. Thrive, from the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute. It's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. Under California's Whistleblower Protection Act, the California State Auditor is responsible for conducting investigations and issuing reports concerning allegations of improper government activities. The State Auditor, Elaine Howle, is our guest and here to explain how the program works and how the results, some results of some recent investigations. So welcome.
Thank you.
Can you explain the whole investigation program? How many complaints do you get every year?
We receive about 1,200 complaints over the course of a calendar year. We track our statistics on a fiscal year, but over a 12-month window, we'll receive about 1,200 inquiries. Now, some of those aren't within our jurisdiction. Our jurisdiction for this investigative program is any state employee, any court employee who has committed an improper act. We could be investigating that individual and reporting back to their employer as to whether or not we substantiated the allegation.
So that brings up an interesting question. What is a, quote, improper government activity? That seems like a very broad term under the State Whistleblower Act.
Sure. There are specific terminology in the Whistleblower Protection Act about what's an improper government activity, but it could be a misuse of state resources, theft of state resources, dishonesty. There are gross wastefulness, so a variety of different kinds of things.
That whole fraud, waste, and abuse topic, it sounds like.
Right, yeah, it can be very broad as far as the types of things we look at.
So how do they specifically contact you? If a state employee or someone else, member of the public, wants to report improper governmental activity, how exactly do they report that to you?
There's a variety of ways. We try to make it as easy as possible for folks to submit a complaint to us or an allegation. Certainly we have an 800 number hotline that we have staff manning during the course of the business day. People can go online.
And that can be anonymous, can't it?
Right, absolutely anonymous. Same with our online. We have a form online that folks can fill out and submit an allegation that way, certainly through fax machine. And
people who still use fax machines?
That's right, right. And then if someone's interested in coming to our office and meeting with our investigators, we're certainly open to that. That doesn't happen very often. Most of the complaints we receive come through our hotline, our online form, and then we actually do receive some complaints in the mail.
I would guess that people would be a little concerned, particularly if they're a current employee of the state, that there might be retaliation if they blow the whistle on improper activity.
Right, and that's why people their identity is protected. They can file a complaint or an allegation anonymously. If they choose not to be anonymous, we still have to protect their identity unless they give us permission to disclose their identity, but they are protected if they come and submit a complaint to us.
So you can independently investigate allegations as well, right? You can take on an investigation on your own behalf.
Exactly. I mean, sometimes my investigators are out conducting, following up on an allegation, and that may not be substantiated, but we identify something else. The other thing our investigators do is we really partner with our audit staff. Oftentimes we're asked to do an audit by the legislature, and we get out there and we've advised our audit staff, if you run into something that you look at potentially fraudulent, let's work with our investigative group, and we may just transfer that particular issue to our investigators. So that's when we would be self-initiating an investigation.
Yeah, I do a lot of work as a federal mediator in labor and employment stuff, and that happens a lot. They start with a sexual harassment complaint, and all of a sudden, all these other things start to pop up.
Right.
Through the course of an investigation.
Absolutely.
What about state agencies? Can you request that they assist you in an investigation?
Sure. There are some allegations that we get that we would need the help of a state agency. Perhaps someone, abuse of state time, so they're not showing up to work or they're leaving work early. It's much easier for an agency to observe that particular employee to substantiate that allegation. So we do work with many state agencies, reach out to them, but our investigators stay involved, giving direction to the agency and what our expectation is as far as what we want that agency to do.
You're not just going to turn it over to them, you're going to stay involved.
Exactly.
So you conduct investigations, but it's my understanding you don't have enforcement power. So if you find improper conduct, then what?
Well, two things. First of all, we will give the appointing authority, the agency that's responsible or that employee works for, specific information, the name of the employee, what the complaint was, what we substantiated, and we actually make recommendations to the agency as to what they do. They certainly have the ability to take disciplinary action against the employee. The other thing that we do that I think is very helpful is we publish our reports. We strip out the name of the particular employee that we've substantiated the complaint or the allegation about, but that hopefully serves as a deterrent effect where people see, oh, there is somebody watching. There is someone who receives these complaints, gets out there and investigates, and then actually publicly reports on those issues.
You just got to send one message, and then the rest of the workforce gets it.
Right.
I was wondering how many improper governmental activities have you uncovered as a result of using this hotline, and what kinds of activities have you identified? How much money's been involved? Any of those kind of numbers?
Well, we track some of that information. I can't give you exactly how many complaints that we've substantiated. We try to issue reports throughout the year, at least semi-annually. But over the last 20 years, we've been tracking, quantifying how much have we identified, and it's about $575 million.
Wow, $500 million.
$500 million over about a 22-year span. And I felt it was really important for our office to quantify, to the extent we can, these abuses. And they may be small individual investigations, but collectively it adds up to a lot of money.
Yeah, it's funny, you talk about the $500 million. Oh, that's not that much because you're talking about a multi-billion-dollar state budget, but $500 million is still $500 million.
That's right.
Well, thanks for explaining the investigation procedure under the State Whistleblowers Protection Act. Up next, a discussion of some of the results of some recent investigations. That conversation next. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome. We're talking to the State Auditor, Elaine Howle, about the results of some recent investigations under the State Whistleblowers Protection Act. It appears that some of the investigations deal with a failure to follow proper procedures. One agency that you investigated, for example, was the state's Correction Health Services, Healthcare Services Group. Can you provide a little background on the work that was needed to be done and the general rules regarding how the state is supposed to contract for that work?
Sure. This issue, the allegation we received was related to the Correctional Healthcare Services realizing that they needed to upgrade some of the facilities to make sure they could provide proper medical care, because that's what the receiver, the healthcare services, is responsible for, the correctional healthcare services. What we were expecting to see is when you're going to engage a vendor to provide those kinds of services, the state, to get our best price, should use a competitive process. Go out there and say, this is the work we're looking for, tell us how much you would charge for it. Corrections didn't do that, or the healthcare, the receiver's office didn't do that. They just went ahead and contracted with a vendor who was on a master list that the state of California has. The problem with that is the services that vendor was supposed to provide under the master services agreement with the state didn't include electrical and the types of things corrections. So they
let's go work you're talking about is there were power outages that needed to be fixed.
Right. It's the electrical units within the various institutions that provide medical care. So they had to upgrade some of that for the equipment and just to make sure that they could provide proper medical care. Well, in using that particular vendor, a couple of problems. First of all, we didn't competitively bid, so we didn't get the best price. The second problem was that contractor ended up subcontracting with someone else who had the expertise to do that type of
Which is probably not all that unusual.
Right.
But
not necessarily all that unusual, but when we went in and really looked at the work the subcontractor was doing and what did the contractor actually do for the state. I mean, and this was $17 million has been paid out at the time we finished the investigation. Okay. The subcontractor did all of the physical work, upgrading the electrical, et cetera, was paid $13.2 or $13.8 million to provide at the various institutions.
I see a gap here.
Plus. But there's $3.2 million of administrative costs that were paid to the contractor, and that's about a 25% administrative fee. So then we said, okay, well, what did the contractor do for that kind of money? Essentially processed invoices that it received from the sub, put a new invoice together and submitted it to the state. So we're paying millions just for a contractor to process paper.
Yeah, that's what I'm hearing. So 25% extra cost just added on to the contract for really doing no extra work.
Exactly, that's what we said in the investigation.
So, okay, so you had $3.2 million out of $17 million has already been paid for administrative fees. But
Right.
my understanding from the report is there's another $831,000
Right.
that still may be due.
Right, because there was, at the time we finished the investigation, there was still $4 million due on the contract. 3.2 again would go to the subcontractor who did the physical work, but another $800,000 to the primary contractor, again for processing invoices. So this primary contractor in total would receive $4 million, essentially to process paperwork.
For process paper, just this administrative work. And so here's the question. You got a contract, and the contract, it says, the state says, we're going to pay the administrative fee. Are they now stuck with paying $4 million in administrative fee for really no value added?
Well, they've already paid out the $3.2 million.
Right,
That's,
so that's
already been
gone.
spent. And the $800,000, again, at the point we had conducted the investigation or completed it, that money was owed to the subcontractor for the work that that firm did. But I think based on the terms of the contract, the state is stuck with the other $800,000. So essentially, we will have paid, the state of California will have paid $4 million. Again, take it back to, we should have competitively bid this contract, and perhaps that subcontractor would have submitted a bid, and that perhaps would have saved the state $4 million.
Take 25%
We wouldn't have
right
had
off
to
the-
pay
off the
the
top.
administrative fees. Exactly.
Wow. So what are your recommendations? And by the way, how did the agency respond to your recommendations?
Well, the agency responded, I mean, healthcare services, again, this is the correctional healthcare services, responded that, you know, they understood and they need to train their staff, but they were also going to defer some of the actions to the Department of Corrections, because the Correctional Healthcare Services works with Department of Corrections on certain things. So they did respond that they need to fix things like this in the future. They shouldn't allow this to happen again in the future, because they understood this was a waste of money.
There was another investigation you did with Caltrans about increasing rental rates. They weren't getting fair market
Right.
value for land they rented to wireless companies,
Right.
communications companies. The state lost about $883,000 in revenue. What happened there? And can the state recoup any of that money?
Well, the state is attempting, after we completed the investigation, we don't know how much they are recouping, but they are going to get some of that money. And essentially what the issue there is the state entered into lease agreements with telecom companies to allow them to have cell towers and other equipment on state land. Okay. Well, those telecom companies need to pay a rental fee. And in those lease agreements, there were terms that said when we hit July of 2012, we need to renegotiate to the fair market value. Well, Caltrans never did that. And of course, the telecom companies weren't going to come forward and say, we think we owe you more money.
Yeah, right.
So we calculated that $800,000 based on what fair market value would have been. And this was in the Bay Area. So
where
it was
land is pricey.
Right. So it was a course of, I think, a 1.5 to 2 year window, this $800,000. The good news is the state is trying to recoup some of that money, but even better, they are in the process or have renegotiated those terms with telecom, so it hopefully won't happen in the future.
Okay, well, up next, sometimes investigations reveal employees with their hands in the till. That conversation next. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with the State Auditor, Elaine Howle, about the results of some recent investigations under the state's Whistleblower Protection Act. One issue is overpaying employees. That seems to be a common problem. For example, you found some state agencies improperly allowed 3 psychologists to earn almost $100,000 a year in extra compensation. What did you uncover?
Right. This was a situation where these psychologists were essentially on call. So they finished their workday, but they were on call in the event there was a need to go back to the correctional facility to provide services. But when we looked at their bargaining agreement, their labor agreement, they were not to be compensated. Their salary already contemplated that they would be on call. So these individuals either received compensating time off or actually payout of some of their leave, because at least one of the employees left state service and was paid.
Cashed out.
Cashed out, essentially. So their bargaining agreement didn't allow for that. Now, the employees, in good faith, were under the belief that they should have been compensated for that.
This isn't a question of employee fraud. This is a
Right.
question of the HR department within that agency wasn't paying attention.
That's exactly right. This doesn't fall on the employees. It falls on the HR department. It falls on the supervisors in those particular institutions. I think it was 2 different prisons. But one of the concerns we had is once HR realized and notified the institutions that these individuals shouldn't be receiving on-call pay or compensation, they continued to provide that compensation. So they essentially ignored some
not listening to the advice
guidance from HR or from headquarters. But once we published the investigation, I think things are now going to change.
It got people's attention for sure.
Right.
Another problem you uncovered concerned Caltrans and a failure of some supervisors to monitor employee attendance and timesheets. What did you find there?
Right. Time and attendance is an allegation that we get often where employees are not fulfilling their responsibility to put in a 40-hour work week. And the allegation we received was related to an engineer at Caltrans who was away from work a lot and was claiming to be working a full 8-hour day. And what we found when we conducted the investigation, interviewed the subject of the allegations, he acknowledged that in many of those days, 55 days, he was out playing golf. He wasn't working.
He wasn't.
Even
that wasn't next to a road or something like that.
No, he was out,
he was just
playing,
playing golf.
Right, and his supervisor wasn't paying attention. I mean, saw his timesheet said 8 hours. Well, where was he? Where was this engineer conducting this work? So we found fault not only with the employee, certainly, for out playing golf on state time, but also the supervisor of that employee not making sure or monitoring his employees to make sure they were putting in their time.
Sleep at the switch. You also have referred some complaints back to various state departments. We talked about that in an earlier segment. One involved, though, an accounting officer at the state's Employment Development Department. What happened there?
Well, this employee, again, this is neglect of duty, essentially spending a lot of personal time during the day. And the way you can see that, and that's why we needed EDD to help us, was looking at the individual's email, determine how many of those emails are business related versus personal, what other activities was this individual performing during the workday that were not related to her job duties, that were either doing things on behalf of family members or friends, that sort of thing. So the department did an investigation for us and certainly confirmed that she was spending significant amounts of time sending personal emails and then actually accessing information within the EDD system on behalf of friends and family, and that's totally inappropriate.
Confidential information, then saying to your friends and family, here's information for unemployment compensation or what have you. I think I read in your report that she was sending out 30 to 97 personal emails a day.
A day, right.
That takes up some time.
Right.
I mean, everybody has a computer at their office, and they probably slip in 1 or 2 personal emails.
Sure, and there
97's a lot.
97's a lot, and there certainly is. There's a rule. There's a de minimis rule in the state that
de minimis means small.
Small amount of small amount of time. Sure, you may need to take a personal call from a family member, or you have a situation, or you shoot off a couple of personal emails. That's no big deal. But when you're spending, hours in the day, 97 emails, that's a lot of emails every single day.
It seems like in both cases, state agencies seem to be allowing offending employees to resign. That happens a lot, as opposed to going through with a formal action and firing them. So my question is, agencies would argue that's better because at least we get rid of the bad employee. And I guess the other side would say, but then there's no record that this was a bad employee because a person just resigned. How do you deal with those situations then?
Well, and that's really a concern that we've had in the past. And what we recommend now, and we see agencies more and more willing to do this, is, okay, that you started down the disciplinary path and the employee chose to resign or the employee chose to retire from state service. We want to see some evidence in their personnel file, because if that individual wants to reinstate or if they resign from one state agency and decide to go work for another, there needs to be a record in their personnel file. And more agencies are more receptive to having that information in the personnel file.
You see that in private companies where they'll put in, not eligible for rehire. Or under investigation or something that kind of...
Right, and that's what the agencies are doing. They're putting a note in their personnel file saying that this individual resigned during the course of an investigation, an ongoing investigation.
That can't look good. Okay, up next, can better training or better technology or both help cut fraud, waste, and abuse in state government? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome. We're talking with the State Auditor, Elaine Howle, about some results of a recent investigation under the state's Whistleblower Protection Act. I guess the first thing we ought to do, though, is put all of this conversation in context. Like any big organization, state government has issues with fraud, waste, and abuse.
Sure.
Does the state have more or less fraud, waste, and abuse than like a large private sector organization?
Yeah, it's difficult to compare. I think the state of California, as we know, state of California is one of the largest economies in the world. It's a huge institution, variety of different departments, localities, et cetera. So I think you are going to have fraud, waste, and abuse in any major entity. What we don't know about the private sector is how much fraud, waste, and abuse is there, because they don't publicly disclose that. I think one of the benefits of our office and the function we perform is that we publicly disclose when we confirm or substantiate an allegation, to try to really serve as a deterrent effect. But certainly there is going to be fraud, waste, and abuse in state government. The goal is to keep that to as small and minimal a level as possible.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, could we compare apples to apples? Is California does it have any more of a problem than other states or the federal government? Or is it pretty comparable?
I think it's pretty comparable. I mean, from what I've heard from colleagues in other states who have a similar function in their office, they have perhaps the same types of abuses and allegations that they receive. In the federal government, I think, our USGAO, which is a comparable entity that audits on behalf of Congress, finds a significant amount of fraud in the federal government.
When the GAO was looking at the stuff in the federal government, what they noticed was problems were occurring in the same kind of agencies. There were 4 or 5. They found that Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment compensation, and the earned income tax credit were a big part of the problem with fraud, waste, and abuse in the federal government. So I'm wondering, are there high error programs in state government? A few programs that you just know there are going to be problems there?
Right, and I think it's comparable to some of the results of GAO. I mean, certainly when you look at some of the healthcare Medi-Cal program in California, there's a lot of different beneficiaries. There are a lot of different types of providers who participate in that program. So the bigger the program, the more people involved in the program, I think the greater the opportunity for fraud, waste, and abuse. And certainly we've looked at the Medi-Cal program and identified fraud from both sides of the equation, the beneficiaries submitting fraudulent claims, but certainly providers. We had 2 audits that we did where they were claiming services to individuals who were deceased. We did a match with the death files that the Social Security puts out.
We just talked earlier about a contractor that was adding 25% of an administrative fee that really weren't doing anything for it.
Right.
It's interesting when you start looking at this, it's not just the typical definition of fraud, waste, and abuse. Sometimes it's things like underpayments, or insufficient documentation, or payments not recorded correctly. It's just human error is also part of the equation here. So are new policies and practices or better policies and practices the answer here?
I think in some cases, yes, more policies and practices, but I think the primary things that need to improve is educating our state employees as to what's expected of them. Certainly mid-managers and supervisors and managers above those individuals, as far as what are the expectations, what should you be doing to monitor your employees, to make sure that your employees are playing by the rules. So training and, in some cases, better policies and procedures.
That's really interesting. Usually training, it's like the art department in a school, right? The first thing to get cut in a lot of organizations is training, but what you're saying is with better training, it's actually less likely you're going to see fraud, waste, and abuse. In other words, it's penny wise and pound foolish to cut training?
Absolutely, because we think training serves 2 purposes. It lets employees know that this is something that our agency, for example, if it's a Caltrans provides training to its managers and to its staff. Those staff know, well, Caltrans takes this seriously. They are going to be looking for fraud, waste, and abuse, and I better not be committing any improper acts because I'm going to be found out. Yeah,
it's always better to put some work in the front end than worry about the problems at the back end, I suppose. Well, I want to thank Elaine Howle, the State Auditor, for joining us. If you want to stay up with state and local politics, you can follow the Maddy Report on Facebook, Twitter, or simply logging onto our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.